We're continuing our series on the life of David this morning, but I want to begin by we're telling you guys a little story. There was a sea captain, back in the days of Pirates of the Caribbean, I guess, and that whole kind of a deal, and the sea captain, he's sailing his ship along, and suddenly there's a cry that goes out from the crow's nest, says, "Pirate ship on the horizon." And the captain calls to his first mate and says, "First mate, bring me my red shirt." The first mate's thinking, this is a little bit strange. It's a funny time for a change of wardrobe when this pirate ship is kind of approaching us. But anyway, he goes, he gets the red shirt, brings it back. The captain puts it on. The ship managed to fight off the pirates perfectly fine. It's a great victory for them. But afterwards, in the aftermath of the battle, the first mate comes to the captain. He says, "Captain, I don't want to question your leadership at all, but it seemed to be a little bit strange that you called for a red shirt just as we were about to go into battle. Why was that?" And the captain says, well, let me tell you. I called for my red shirt so that if in the midst of battle I was to be wounded and start to bleed, the men wouldn't see it and they wouldn't get discouraged and they wouldn't get disheartened and they want to give up because they saw me being wounded. And the first mate's, Captain, you're a genius. That's such a good idea. Awesome. A few days later, they're sailing along their merry way again when another cry goes up from the crow's nest. 5 pirate ships on the horizon. The captain looks to his first mate and says, "First mate, bring me my brown pants." You see, leaders have influence. Leaders have a huge deal of influence. And as I said, we're continuing with our series on the rhythm of the heart, exploring the life of King David and what we can learn from David about becoming people after God's heart. Now, King David was a great leader. He led incredibly well in so many different areas. He obviously was a king. He led the government. He led the whole country. He was also a military leader and commander. He had a family, which he led. And he also had a role in leading the church of the day, in leading the spiritual life of the nation. But when I talk about leadership, that probably brings up all sorts of different thoughts and emotions, good and bad, memories of good and bad experiences that you've had of maybe both being led by other people and you yourself maybe being a leader. We come at leadership from all sorts of different places. Some of you right now are currently functioning as leaders in a leadership position within the church or within the home or within your workplace or within local government or another organization. Some of you have led in the past, but you're not currently leading anything position-wise right now. Some of you have a call to leadership. You know it's there, but it hasn't yet been realized. You haven't yet stepped up into that call. And some of you have probably never even thought about leadership, and you have no desire to think about leadership whatsoever. But wherever you're at today, as we talk about the importance of leadership, and we talked about some practical lessons in leadership from the life of David, I really hope and believe there's going to be something that encourages and challenges each and every one of us. But let me begin by talking about really what leadership is and why it's important to kind of set the scene. Let me tell you this. Leadership is not about position. Leadership is not about power. And leadership is not about prestige. It's not about position. It's not about power. It's not about prestige. Having a title does not make you a leader. Okay? You can be the manager at work and not be the leader. Ordering people around does not make you a leader. Okay? Attracting attention to yourself because you've got a microphone does not make you a leader. That's not what leadership is. John Maxwell, kind of one of the foremost leadership gurus in the world, says that leadership is influence. Leadership is influence. And President Dwight D. Eisenhower said something which I love about leadership. He said, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because they want to do it. Not because you want them to do it, but because they want to do it. Leadership is about helping people catch a vision for changing the world and together seeing it become a reality, right? Proverbs 29:18 says, without people, vision, the people perish, or the people cast off restraint. And it's the job of a leader to communicate vision and direction to people and to motivate them to make sure that we accomplish all that God has for us and that things don't descend into anarchy. It's a key part of what leadership is. Everything rises and falls on leadership, Maxwell goes on to say. And really, over the years, I've come to believe he's 100% correct. Everything does rise or fall on leadership. This world needs leaders. Your family needs leaders. Your workplace needs leaders. This church needs leaders. We need you to lead us. There's a book by Seth Godin called Tribes. We need you to lead us. And it's true. We need more leaders, not less. Because leadership's not just about position. It's not just about power. It's not about prestige. It's about influence. It's about having a positive influence in those spheres that God's placed us. So wherever you're at with leadership today, whether you feel like, yep, I want to be a leader, or no, I don't want to be a leader at all, whether you're currently leading, whether you're not currently leading, whether you've had good experiences of leadership, you've had bad experiences of leadership, I want to unpack 4 little lessons in leadership today from the life of King David, one of the greatest leaders in Scripture. So we're going to begin in 1 Samuel chapter 16. If you have a Bible, maybe turn there or on your phone. 1 Samuel 16. And then we're going to start at verse 6. So as you're finishing up finding that, let me give you just a little bit of background. So King Saul has been the leader of Israel, but because of his disobedience, the Lord has rejected him. The Lord said, no, you can't be leader anymore. You can't be the king anymore. You're being disobedient to me. And so the Lord sends the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem to anoint one of the sons of this guy called Jesse to be the new king. Okay, so this is where we're picking up in verse 6. Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him, and they asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shamar pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" Hey, bro, did you forget about someone? "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He's tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. So the first thing that we need to do in order to step up into leadership is that we need to respond to the call. Okay? We need to respond to the call. And I believe that to one degree or another, we are all called to leadership. Because if leadership is influence, as John Maxwell says, we're all supposed to be leaders because as believers, we're supposed to influence the world around us. The Great Commission is a call to leadership. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. That's a call to influence, right? It's a command to influence. Therefore, it's a command to leadership, to be leaders in this world that we live in, to help influence culture. But it's really easy to miss the call of leadership on our lives because of a number of common objections that we tend to have in our hearts. And we see three of these objections right here in the calling of David. The first objection is, I'm not qualified. Okay? That's the number one objection that people have when God calls them to do something. You see, in Samuel's eyes, the qualifications of being for king were personified in the eldest son, in Eliab. He was tall, and by all accounts, he had everything externally that would be expected in the king. Samuel saw him and went, surely this is the Lord's anointed. That is a fine specimen of a man right there. But the truth is, God doesn't look at the outward appearance. He looks at the heart. And so when we start to look at things from a human perspective and a worldly perspective, we go, how can I be a leader? How can God call me to do that? God's called you because he knows what's going on in your heart. He's seen your heart. And you may not have everything that you need. But as the saying goes, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Okay? The second objection that we have is, oh, well, I'm not like so-and-so. It's comparison. And comparison's a really dangerous trap that we fall into really, really, really easily. It would have been easy for David to compare himself with King Saul, the man that he was going to be replacing. Because the Bible tells us that Saul came from an influential family. He was extremely handsome. He was a head taller than everybody else in Israel. He was huge. He was a big guy. He was a skilled and he was an experienced warrior. And so David, this young guy, could have easily felt inferior. But David didn't enter into the trap of comparison as we go on and we read, especially when it comes to the story of Goliath in just another chapter's time. He was firm in his identity as a child of God. He was confident in the unique skills and abilities that God had blessed him with. While Saul went out to battle with a great big sword and all this armor, when David tried to put it on, he's like, I can't do this. I'm not used to this. This is not me. This is not my strength. My strength is not armor and a big old sword. My strength is some stones and a slingshot. And that's why he succeeded. It's easy to think to ourselves, well, I can't preach like Bill Johnson or Christine Kane, or I can't lead worship like Phil Wickham or Carrie Job or whoever your person is that you looked up to, or whatever other leader there is. Let me tell you something. No, you can't. But you can do those things like you. And God would much rather you did those things like you than you try to do them like someone else. The third objection that we tend to have is that I'm not ready. Right? I'm not qualified, I'm not like so-and-so, or I'm not ready. David was young. He had no leadership experience. He was the youngest of 8 sons. He was used to being led, not leading. Jesse didn't even think it was worth having him be there. How were people going to follow a kid as their king? The truth is, actually, no, David wasn't ready at all. He wasn't ready to be king. But in saying yes to the call, he was saying yes to a season of preparation. God had every intention of getting David ready. But first, before he could enter into that season of preparation, he had to say yes. we got to say yes. That's where it begins with. It begins with responding to the call and saying, God, I don't know how you're going to do this. I don't know how you're going to get me ready. I don't feel like I'm ready for this in any way right now. I'm not like so-and-so. I'm not qualified for this in any kind of way. But yes, I trust you. I believe in you. If you're calling me to do something, it's the best place I can be. We have to start with a yes in our hearts, just like David did. The second thing we need to do is we need to embrace the journey that God has us on, this season of preparation. We're going to continue right in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14 through 23. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I've seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is fine looking, and the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Whenever the Spirit from God would come on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave. See, once we recognize this call to leadership like David, we're probably going to be, we might be kind of excited, like, okay, this new thing, God's called me to be a leader. God's going to do all these incredible and amazing things with me and through me. Can you imagine David being anointed king by Samuel? He's like, okay, where do I start? Where's my crown? Where's my throne? When do I get to start being king? But rather than stepping into the fullness of his calling straight away and replacing King Saul, what does David end up doing? He ends up serving King Saul. Now, I can imagine a little bit of consternation and confusion in David's heart and in his mind right now. He's probably sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, God. You rejected this guy. You do not want him to be king anymore. You picked me instead, but now you want me to serve the guy who disobeyed you and who you've rejected. How does that make any sense? Like, how am I supposed to do that? The truth is, when God's called us, he leads us into a journey of preparation. And learning how to serve is often the first step in that journey of preparation. I read a story about a young woman who wanted to go to college, but her heart sank when she read a question in the application form that asked, "Are you a leader?" And being both honest and conscientious, she wrote, "No." And she returned the application expecting the worst. But to her surprise, she received a letter from the college, and it said this. It said, "Dear applicant, a study of the application forms reveals this year our college will have 1,452 new leaders. We're accepting you because we feel it's imperative they have at least one follower." If we want to be good leaders, we have to first learn how to be good followers. There's a principle in Scripture and in the kingdom of God, a principle of sowing and reaping. What we sow is what we reap. So if we want to reap followers who follow us well as leaders, we got to learn first how to be a follower. If we're bad followers, what are we going to reap when we become leaders? We're going to reap bad followers. As a leader, if you want people to be able to follow you, you have to learn how to follow someone else first. Like David, Joseph is another example of an influential leader who learned the importance of serving. When we first meet Joseph in Genesis 37, he's 17 years old, and he has this gift of of dreams. God speaks to him in dreams, and he can interpret these dreams. And in a dream, God reveals to him his destiny. He sees in a dream his parents and his brothers all bowing down to him. He sees that he's destined for a position of leadership. He's destined for a position of authority. And he goes to his brothers and to his parents and tells them about this dream. And it does not go very well. Because if we were being generous, we might just say that Joseph maybe lacked some social skills, and maybe the way that he told his parents that they were going to be bowing down to him wasn't the greatest way to do it. If we're being less generous, we might say that Joseph was a bit of a brat, maybe, and that his dream about all this power and influence was going to his head. But either way, we know that his ultimate destiny was to be the second most powerful man in the world, to be the advisor to Pharaoh. And in fact, the Bible says that Pharaoh says to him, hey, you're going to be my right-hand guy, second only in power to me. But the Bible also tells us that Joseph was a father to Pharaoh. So actually, in some ways, Joseph was the most powerful man in the world. That was his destiny. But if at the age of 17, when God first showed him this destiny, when he first heard the call from God to this position, if he'd become the second most powerful man in the world at that moment at 17 years old, I do not think things would have gone well for Joseph. And I don't think things would have gone well for the nation of Egypt either. God had him walk out his destiny by becoming a slave, by becoming a servant in the house of Potiphar, becoming a servant in the jail that he eventually found himself in. And when he'd learned how to serve for 13 years, that's when God said, okay, now you're ready. Now you're ready for this role that I've been preparing you for. When he first shared the dream that God had given him at 17 years old, he was all about his own success. He was like, hey, you guys are going to bow down to me. It's about me. He was self-focused. But 13 years later, as a slave, as a servant, as a prisoner, all those things had taught him how to serve the needs of others. Because in leadership, there's a difference between success and significance. There's a difference between success and significance. John Maxwell says, success is when I add value to myself. Significance is when I add value to others. Success is when I add value to myself. Significance is when I add value to others. Joseph's focus shifted from selfishness to servanthood. It shifted from success to significance. And that's when he was finally ready to step up into this destiny that God had for him. And notice what his destiny actually was, though, as well. Because, yes, it was power, it was authority, it was influence. But it wasn't in order to benefit himself. It wasn't even in order to benefit Pharaoh. It was to benefit the people of Egypt and the surrounding region. He was put in charge of managing the food supply in the middle of a famine. It was for the sake of the people that he had that power, that influence, that authority. It wasn't for himself. Even Joseph, the second most powerful man in the entire planet, never graduated from serving. Leadership doesn't exempt us from service. It actually increases our responsibility to serve others. But during these seasons of preparation, God isn't just working on our hearts. He's also developing our skill. That's why then in Psalm 78, verse 72, it says that David shepherded Israel with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands he led them. Heart and skill come together, and God has us work on both in those seasons of preparation. In the years leading up to becoming king, David learned how to be a good leader. And that's one of the beautiful things about leadership. You can learn it. You can learn to be a good leader. Decades before he became president, Abraham Lincoln began his military career when he assembled a group of men to fight in the Black Hawk War. And in those days, what generally happened was the person who assembled a group of volunteers for a militia often became the leader, and they were given a military rank. And so Lincoln was given the rank of captain because he assembled these men together to fight in a militia in the Black Hawk War. But the problem was Lincoln knew very little about leadership, and he knew absolutely nothing about soldiering. And one day he was marching a couple of dozen men across a field, and he needed to guide the men through a gate and into another field, but he couldn't manage it. And recounting this event later, Lincoln said, "I could not for the life of me remember the proper word of command, forgetting my company endwise. Finally, as we came near the gate, I shouted, 'This company is dismissed for 2 minutes, when it will fall in again on the other side of the gate.'" See, many leaders prove themselves during wartime, and they advance in rank. Lincoln actually did the opposite. He started off the war as a captain, and he finished it as a private. He got demoted because he was such a bad leader. But fortunately for Lincoln, and fortunately for this country, leadership can be learned. Lincoln was able to learn how to be a good leader between the end of the war and becoming president. And obviously he became one of the most influential and important presidents that this nation's ever seen because he learned how to be a leader. He wasn't naturally gifted at leadership, but he learned how to do it. We can learn in these seasons of preparation. So if we can submit to the process that God has us in, if we can walk through this journey of developing both our heart and skill, we'll be ready for the next key in stepping up into leadership. And that is to be faithful with little. Be faithful with little. Because as we step into leadership, God's going to give us leadership influence that's appropriate for where we're at. Okay? Luke 16, verse 10 says, "Whoever can be trusted with little can also be trusted with much." We're going to start with God giving us little. We have to prove ourselves that we can do the work that it takes and that we can be a good steward of the little before we can be given the much. Really, we call this progressive release. And we see it in the life of David. After David comes to the court of King Saul to serve as the king's personal demon soother, he becomes to greater prominence after he kills Goliath, the story that we all know well, and we talked about a few weeks ago. And after Goliath, he ends up with a leadership position in Saul's army. Then he ends up as captain of Saul's bodyguard, and then he ends up as general of the whole army. He kind of has this process of being entrusted with more and more responsibility. And then Saul turns on him. Saul thinks, hey, this guy's getting too much influence. I'm afraid right now. So, hey, I'm going to try and kill him, basically. I'm going to throw a spear at him a number of different times. David runs away. But even then, David's influence grows with the men who come to him. More and more men flock to him, are drawn to him. And that influence grows. And then at the age of 30, he partially sees his destiny fulfilled. He becomes the king of the tribe of Judah at Hebron. But it takes another 7 years on top of that before he finally becomes king of the whole of Israel. So we see this process where he gets entrusted with responsibility. Bit by bit, by bit by bit, more and more people come to recognize him as a leader. He gets to experience what it's like to be king over one of the tribes of Israel before he finally becomes king over the entire nation. And we might get excited when we feel called to leadership, and we get excited about having a call to great leadership significance and influence. But actually, we find ourselves starting out by leading a little Bible study with 3 other guys or gals. Or maybe at work, you think, hey, I'm going to be the boss. God's called me to be the CEO of a company, to have a high-level position, have influence in the marketplace. But actually, you just start off leading a small little team in a temporary project at work. The key to becoming a great leader is to be faithful with what God gives to you. And as you do it well, God's going to give you more. Charles Spurgeon was one of the most famous preachers, in the world, but particularly in the UK and in London. He preached to thousands of people in London every single Sunday. But he started off his ministry by passing out tracts and teaching in a Sunday school class as a teenager. He was eventually invited to come and speak obscure places in the countryside to preach. But then after that, he became one of the greatest preachers in the entire nation. And Spurgeon once said, "I'm perfectly sure that if I had not been willing to preach to those small gatherings of people in obscure country places, I should never have had the privilege of preaching to thousands of men and women in large buildings all over the land." We can have grand plans of what we want our life to look like, of the influence that God's going to give us. But often the most spiritual thing that we can do is to just do what's in front of us. It's not wrong to dream. It's not wrong to dream big dreams. We should be dreaming big dreams. We need to dream God-sized dreams. If you can accomplish your dreams without the help of God, you're dreaming too small. Dream big dreams, but do what God puts in front of you. They're not mutually exclusive. That's what I once heard Bill Johnson say. He just said, all my life, I've just done what God put in front of me to do. I've just said yes to what God gave me. He didn't go out to have a plan to create this big Bethel movement, with a big church and a move that influences, thousands, if not millions of Christians around the world. He just did what God asked him to do. He just did what God put in front of him. And sometimes that's the most spiritual thing that we can do. But whatever our leadership journey looks like, whatever those steps that God leads us through, it's really important that we learn to be satisfied in doing what God puts before us. And we don't try and speed up the process. Okay? David had the perfect opportunity to speed up God's process of making him king. In 1 Samuel 24, David's on the run from Saul. Saul's after him. And Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself. The Bible keeps things real, you guys. Even characters in the Bible had to pee. Saul goes into this cave, but he doesn't know that David and his men are hiding in the back of the cave. He goes in there on his own, bit of privacy, away from his bodyguard. And David's men say to him, look, God has put Saul in your hands right now. Kill him and you'll be king. So David takes his knife, but rather than killing Saul, he creeps up on him and he just cuts the corner off of his robe to prove to Saul that, hey, look, you were in my hands. I could have killed you right now. Here's the proof. Here's the little bit of cloth. Same thing happens a few chapters later on. David and his men come down into Saul's camp, and he steals a water jug and a spear from by Saul's head and retreats and yells across the valley and said, hey, look what I just picked up from beside of your head. I could have grabbed this spear and I could have stuck it in you, but I didn't. He says, it's not for me to lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. No matter what respect David might have not had for Saul, he had respect for the fact that God had put Saul in that place. And it was up to God to remove Saul from that position, not for David to take it. It was up to David to trust in God's plan, to trust in God's process, and not to try and speed up that process. David understood a really important principle. It's God who does the promoting. It says in Psalm 75, verses 6 through 7, no one from the east or the west or from the desert can exalt themselves. It is God who judges. He brings one down. He exalts another. David could have taken that crown, but he chose to wait for God to give it to him. And that meant he waited nearly another decade before he became king over all Israel. But he was determined not to speed up God's process. And we need to have the same attitude. It's not up to ourselves to promote ourselves. It's up to God to promote us when he's ready. See, God is a God of process. And there's another process, a final process, that's also really important to embrace if we're going to be successful in leadership. And that's the process of reproducing ourselves in others. As leaders, we want to build a legacy. One of my favorite lines from the musical Hamilton talks about legacy, and it defines legacy as planting flowers in a garden that you'll never see. I think that's a beautiful picture of what legacy is. And if leadership is influence, then the greatest leader is the leader who considers their legacy and extends their influence into future generations, not just for the here and now. And that's what David did with his son Solomon. David's desire was to build a temple for the Lord. He wanted a glorious building built to the glory of God to be his legacy. But the Lord said to him, "No, David, you can't build the temple. You've got too much blood on your hands. So instead, I'm going to have your son Solomon build the temple for my name that you've dreamt of." 1 Chronicles 22, verses 6 through 10. You can turn there with me if you want. It says, "Then David called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, 'My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever.'" Now, David could have gotten upset at this point. He could have said, "That was my dream. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a house for you, God. But actually, you're not going to let me do that. You're going to have my son do that. That's not fair. That was my dream. That was my idea. In fact, the temple wasn't even God's idea." Solomon later on is praying at the dedication of his temple, and he says, "God, that there was a dream in my father's heart to build a temple." And God said, "Okay, let's build a temple then." God never said, "Hey, I want you to build a temple." David said, "I want to build a temple for you." And God said, "Okay." So it was David's idea from start to finish. It wasn't even God's idea. It was David's dream. It was his vision. He could have got upset and got mad and started pouting and sulking that he didn't get to build the temple. He could have been disobedient. He could have gone and built the temple anyway. Could have said, "Forget that, God, la, can't hear you. I'm just going to go ahead and do it." But he didn't do that. Instead, what he did was he did absolutely everything that he could do to make Solomon successful. He made preparations. He assembled materials. He invested in his son. Rather than building a legacy in stone, David built a legacy in his son. And a legacy that you build in someone else is way more powerful than a legacy that you build in stone. Because a legacy that you build in someone else is eternal. Those stones of that temple are actually no longer there. The base, the Temple Mount, is still there, but the actual temple building itself isn't there. There's a Muslim mosque sitting on that site right now. But by investing in other people, we're investing in something eternal, because people are eternal. Each and every one of us is eternal. Each and every one of those people out there is eternal. Whether they're going to be eternally with God in heaven is another issue. But we're eternal people. We are created to be eternal people. And when we build our legacy in others, when we raise up others, when we raise up other leaders, when we invest in other people, we're building an eternal legacy. It's one of the most important roles that a leader has, is to reproduce themselves in others. That's the number one responsibility for those of us who are parents. In leadership in our home, is to invest ourselves in our kids. Good leaders are always trying to work themselves out of a job. A good leader doesn't go, this is my job, you can't have it. A good leader says, you want this job? Awesome, I'll train you how to do it. There you go. Because there's always work available for a good leader who knows how to reproduce themselves. Really, for any leader, the first line on their job description should be reproduce yourself. Before you're actually leading anything, it's reproducing yourselves. In Ephesians, where we have the fivefold ministry, the apostles and prophets and pastors and teachers and evangelists, it says that those gifts are given to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The first job of an apostle is not to be an apostle. The first job of a prophet is not to be a prophet. The first job of those people of a prophet is to make more prophets, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, to train and teach others how to be prophetic. There's always room for a leader who knows how to reproduce leaders. As I quoted earlier, success is when I add value to myself. Significance is when I add value to others. And so I want to ask you guys today, what do you want to do with your life? Do you want to be successful, or do you want to be significant? That's the decision we have to make, success or significance. Your family, your workplace, this church needs you, needs your leadership. And I'm not just talking about positions of leadership. I'm not trying to get you guys all to sign up to be leaders of a ministry. That's a very narrow idea and a view of what leadership is. Leadership is influence. It's influencing others positively. It's leading the way. It's saying, hey, come on, follow me. Let's do this together. Whether that means that you have, a corner office at work, or whether it's leading your family into more and more into the things of God, or into having a healthy outlook on life, or developing and building healthy relationships and healthy boundaries. Like, leadership looks like so many different things. But we need you to lead us. Your family needs you to lead them. Your workplace needs you to lead them. We need leaders. Everything rises and falls on leadership. Are you going to answer God's call to leadership today?